Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot, and I'm happy to be back on in our normal morning time. Sorry about the episode coming out late yesterday. Stuff out there in the unanimated so-called real world interfered with my scary good time. Before we get started with over an hour of nothing but Dogman stories, I'd like to let you know that due to a few requests, I'm going to continue the Brian's Lichen Troubles story. I have a lot more material, years of stories. I'm going to pair it with this other really long story that I'll cut up in chapters as well. So it'll be 2 serials, and I'll put out the first episode this Saturday. Maybe it'll be Saturday afternoon serials or Saturday scary soap operas or something like that. Then, Sundays, of course, we have another uncensored Dogman story that will be for the paid subscribers only. You can become a Scary Stories paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. Behind me, you see an image of Wolf Swamp in Massachusetts, where the wolf people lived when the French first came to the area. Talking here about how the Northeast Comic-Con was located this time right next to a place called Wolf Swamp. I joked about calling it Dogman Swamp, and someone even sent in a story claiming they had seen a dogman there. Some of you asked me to go take pictures of it, and Gary Summers, the owner of Northeast Comic-Con, pictured here with a certain famous person, also encouraged me to go take pictures of it. So I wandered into the woods with my trusty cell phone camera in hand. It wasn't long before I came upon a shocking sight. Caterpillars. Big ones. No, not the little worm-like things that crawl on trees. I mean the large yellow trucks that pour sand into swamps until they are filled in. Are they filling in Dogman Swamp? Judge for yourself by viewing this photo I took. I'm not 100% certain that this is Dogman Swamp behind the chain link fence, since I was only using my phone's GPS and I might be off. But it's definitely right near there. Why are they filling in Dogman Swamp? Is it because we talked about it too much? Are the men in black gonna come silence me now? I actually shouldn't joke around about that, as our first story in this episode is about the men in black, or a woman in black to be more precise. And the story is called Dogman and the Woman in Black, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories, here is something that happened to me way back in the 70s when I was in my early 20s. Feel free to dramatize it or stretch it out as long as you stick to the facts about the creature encounter and the weird people in black. So I was driving home after a long day working at a store in an adjoining town. The road was a 2-lane blacktop that stretched for a few miles between 2 dense patches of forest. There were no streetlights on that road back then, although they did get put in back in the 80s. But that night, all I had to see with was the moon and my headlights. That's why, when I thought I saw a man limping along the right side of the road, I slowed down and aimed my car directly at him, trying to get him in my headlights and see if he needed any help from me. This was the 1970s. We were still sometimes neighborly back then, although I admit it had already started to go out of fashion. What I got in my headlights that night wasn't a man, though. It was a beast of some sort, walking on its hind legs, facing away from me, walking away from me. It wasn't a bear, unless bears come in gray fur now and have a long wolf tail behind them. When my lights hit him, he turned quickly and glared at me, his eyes reflecting my headlights and making him appear almost supernatural or demonic. It was a dog-like beast, but huge, taller than a man, and somehow able to walk on its hind legs. I turned my car back onto the highway and had every intention of speeding out of there, but as my foot hit the gas pedal to accelerate, the creature leaped out in front of me. It was blocking the road. I tried to slam on the brakes, but there was no way to stop in time. Swerving in either direction would result in me slamming into a tree, and maybe that's what the creature's plan was. I tried to stop and closed my eyes, and I screamed. Eventually, the car came to a halt, and you know what? I had never heard the sound of a collision. I looked around frantically. I looked out at the hood. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I got out of the car and ran behind. There was nothing in the road. I looked under my car and I found nothing. ran back to the front of my car. There was no sign anything had hit into it. There were no dents anyplace. There was no fur on the ground. There was no anything. Absolutely no evidence that anything had just happened existed any place that I could perceive. So I shook my head, got back into the car, and continued driving home, more than a little shaken up and more than a little confused. The entire time I saw nobody pass me on the road in either direction. Of this I am certain. From the time I saw the creature until I got home, I had the lonely country road to myself, and I am positive nobody could have seen what happened to me unless they were hiding in the trees and bushes spying. When I got home, I heated up the oven and took out a TV dinner to start to thaw it. Then I turned on Johnny Carson. I was about to sit down and watch when there was a knock at my front door. Now, this was nearly midnight, so nobody should have been knocking on my front door. I was still on alert because of the disappearing dog man, so the idea of someone, or something, outside my door at midnight put the fear of God into me. I was now as scared as when I first saw the monster snarling at me alongside the road. I didn't know what to expect was outside my house, but I told myself, monsters don't knock, and that gave me a little bit of courage. So I looked out the window, and it was a little light-skinned woman or a very feminine-looking man with short hair and a dark man's business suit on. This was a real WTF moment for me, but not my first of the evening, obviously. I opened the inner door, leaving the screen door closed. "Yes?" I asked. She spoke. It sounded like a woman, but with a strange, garbled voice and an accent I couldn't quite place. She told me some long, boring, rambling nonsense about being an expert from the government here to educate herself using my knowledge on behalf of the government or something like that. It was fairly close to gibberish, and she droned on until I felt like going to bed. Then she asked me to invite her in for some questioning, and before I realized what I was doing, we were both settling down at my kitchen table, and she was preparing to question me. Question me? At midnight? About what? I tried to remember if she had shown me any ID, but I didn't think she had. I asked her if I could see some ID, but she said she had already shown it to me, so I figured it must be legit then. I don't know why, but it all seemed more and more normal to me the more I tried to think about it, but failed. No alarm bells were going off until I saw, in the harsh fluorescent light of my kitchen, that her skin was paler than it had originally seemed when I saw her in the dark through the front window. Now when I could see her better, she looked ill to me. Her skin was so pale, it looked like she had been wrapped in one big band-aid for a month, and she just took it off before knocking on my door. And it wasn't just that. She was sweating, too. It was the strangest kind of sweating, almost like her skin itself was dissolving in front of my eyes. I fought myself back to awareness and asked her if she was all right. She said she was fine, but she was going to need a glass of water in 10 minutes. I stood to go get her some water, but she informed me in her garbled voice and mysterious accent that 10 minutes had not yet passed, so I sat back down. She informed me that the government had full awareness of my recent sighting and that they needed me to relate the details of what happened for their records. I tried playing dumb, acting like I hadn't had any strange experiences lately. Meanwhile, I was racking my brain trying to figure out how anyone, let alone the government, could have known about what happened to me only 20 minutes ago, and how they could possibly have dispatched someone to see me so quickly. There were no military bases closer than 75 miles from my home as far as I was aware. I spent the rest of the interview evading questions. "Please describe its appearance," she requested. "Please describe what's appearance," I responded, and so on. She seemed to be having increasing difficulty parsing my answers. A little while later, she informed me that 10 minutes had passed and she would need the water now. I got her a glass of tap water, then watched as she took out a white tablet about the size of an old silver dollar and dropped it into the water. It looked like an Alka-Seltzer tablet, and it fizzed like one too. She drank around half the glass, then got this strange Mona Lisa smile on her weird pale face. She sat there looking almost blissed out for a few seconds before she pulled some paperwork out of her jacket and a pen and asked me to sign a, quote, confession, unquote. I seriously did not like the sound of that word. I grabbed the papers. It must have been about 12 sheets. Scanning down the first page, it was a lot of legal jargon. Then it was the description of how I had seen the creature, how I had run into it, but it had disappeared before we could impact each other. It was all there, told from my point of view. But I had never told her any of that. Or at least, I didn't remember telling her. Now I was panicking and angry. I stood up and threw her papers at her. I demanded she tell me who she was and what kind of game she was playing. She took the papers, put them back in her jacket, stood up, and let herself out of the house. Just like that. I, for some reason, just stood there and watched her do it, too. I made no effort to stop her. I wonder if the power to do so had been taken from me somehow. I ran to the front window after she left, but I couldn't see her anywhere. I also couldn't see her vehicle. How had she gotten here and how had she gotten away? I remember waiting around expecting her to jump out of the bushes or something at any moment when the strangest thing happened. A car pulled up in the darkness. A long, black limousine pulled up in front of my house quietly with its headlights turned off. I hadn't heard it approaching, but there it was. I ducked down, more than a little frightened about what was going to come out of that thing. As it turned out, what came out was two men, dressed similarly to how the woman had been dressed, but wearing dark hats as well. That made it harder to make out their faces or features, but they seemed to also be pale-skinned people. They pulled something out of the back seat, and at first I thought it was some kind of weapon. I have to admit, I was about as scared as it's possible to be without fainting. So the thing turned out to be a tripod with a camera, or what looked like a camera, on top. They seemed to be taking pictures of my house in the dark. After I guess maybe 45 seconds or a minute, they got back into the car with their camera and tripod and they drove off, never having turned the car's headlights on. That's it. That's my entire story. I wasn't threatened. I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't told to keep quiet about what I'd seen, but I had my house photographed or something, and they never came back. Some of the people I tell this to think they were aliens and that they both manufactured the Dogman and made him disappear just to study my reaction. Maybe the Dogman was from their reality, or maybe the Dogman was some sort of holographic projection. Did I see it when I wasn't supposed to? Or was it put there just for me to see? Since I can't know who or what those weird, pale, melting people were who visited me, I can't even hazard an educated guess. That was the strangest day of my life, and everything that happened that night remains, to this day, a complete and utter mystery to me. Just another weird story about the Dogman. Dogman in the Root Cellar, as told to Peter Bernard. My family moved every 3 or 4 years when I was a little kid, depending on where my father could find work. When I was 11 to 13, we rented a very old house on the outskirts of town. School was in town and within walking distance, plus we were surrounded by woods and friends of our own age. My sister and I both remember this as the most fun time of our childhood. Now, this was back in the 1950s, but the house we lived in was old, even to us back then. It had been a small family farm earlier on, as in maybe 10 years earlier. A freshwater stream ran through the back, and we had a well and a root cellar. The root cellar was built into a nearby hill. It was basically a small cave with a door on it, all inside a little hill. Inside we kept stuff that we wanted to keep cool and dry. My mother would buy food in bulk and store it there because shopping was a bit of a hassle for us without our own car. So we'd get a load of potatoes or rice or whatever delivered into the root cellar, that sort of thing. I used to love the root cellar because it seemed like the house of an elf or a fairy or something. It seemed pre-human, like it had always been there. So, one day we were playing outside and my mom called out to tell us dinner was going to be late and we could play a little longer. It had just started to get a little dark and a little scary too. We were just 2 kids, me 11 and her 9, and we were alone with a very large and living forest around us with trees reaching up far into the sky. We usually weren't allowed out this late, so that added to the excitement. We couldn't waste this opportunity. We decided to tell ghost stories to each other in the encroaching darkness, but neither of us could remember how any of them went, and we utterly failed at scaring each other in the slightest. So then my sister started challenging me, asking me if I was brave enough to go sit in the root cellar alone in the darkness. I challenged her back. She told me it was probably haunted in there and a ghost would reach out and touch me. I told her spiders would crawl up her back, and I saw her expression crack. Ghosts were theoretically scary, but spiders were definitely scary, especially to little sisters. So she said if I could sit there for a minute, that she would go second, and we had a deal. I thought we should have a word to shout out in case we needed the door open in an emergency. I was untying the rope, holding the doors shut as we were finalizing the details of our agreement with each other regarding our bet about sitting alone in the dark in the root cellar when BAM! The doors of the cellar burst open from the inside and knocked me and my sister both backward onto our butts. My sister screamed and I possibly might have as well. What had come out of the cellar? Looking behind us, we saw, running away at unfathomable speed, the big bad wolf from the Three Little Pigs cartoon. I mean, it was not a cartoon. It was a tall, hairy man monster with a dog's or a wolf's head and a very long snout with very tall ears racing away on its hind legs like a man. I believe it had a tail. It was not clothed. The fur was dark brown or black. It was hard to tell in the twilight. My sister and I ran in the house and cried to our mother about what happened. She ordered us to go back out and lock up the root cellar, but we cried and refused, saying there was a wolf man out there. She went and did it herself, then came in and gave both of us fairly harsh spankings for causing extra work for her, then sent us to bed without dinner. How had the thing gotten into the shelter if the door was tied shut from the outside? The shelter did not lead to a cave system or anything. It was a hole in a rock in the ground that someone put a door on. It had no tunnels leading off or other rooms inside. How could this werewolf man have gotten in there? It remains one of the great mysteries of my life. Whenever things start to seem mundane, I think back on the time I got knocked on my butt as my root cellar got evacuated by Dogman. Dogman of the Heat Wave. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. Back in 1977, I was 13 years old. My family lived in the Bronx, and although we weren't rich, we were usually fairly happy. One exception to that rule was the summer of 1977. I think it was July that year, but it might have been August. We had a heat wave that was the worst of my childhood. My family couldn't afford to run the air conditioner all day long, and after the third day over 90 degrees, the air conditioner didn't really do its job anyway. My father had an uncle that we never met who lived upstate, and he arranged to send us kids, me, my sister Izzy, and my brother Manny, aged 10, 12, and me at 13, up to stay at his place in the country. When we got there, we realized it was a farm, but he wasn't farming anything. There were no animals, nothing was planted, but he lived in an old farmhouse next to a forest, and there was a barn and the remains of a silo that we were told to stay away from because it was falling apart and dangerous. The barn wasn't in very good shape either, but we didn't inform our uncle of that since it was the only cool place we could hang out in during the heat wave. So, the first night there, my sister woke up the whole house screaming, and we ran to her, and she was screaming about a dog man who rumbled at her through the window. Manny and I looked out the window, and there was a relatively flat roof area out there. It would have been possible for someone to actually be there, but we saw no sign of anyone, and we couldn't see any movement out in the yard or in the adjacent forest. My uncle and his wife were very annoyed and told my sister she was only dreaming, and that it was impossible for anyone to be outside the window. Manny and I defended Izzy and offered to climb out on the roof outside the window to demonstrate how someone definitely could have been there. This only made the adults more unhappy, and we were ordered back to our room and to go to sleep. We went back as ordered, waited a few minutes, then silently snuck back into our sister's room to sleep on her floor and guard her. Nothing else happened that night, and the next morning our aunt was actually nice to us when she found us sleeping on the floor by Izzy's bed. She could see that we were tight-knit, and so that night she prepared our larger bedroom to also accommodate our sister, and her bed was furthest from the window. Our uncle was furious that his wife was now humoring children. His reasoning was that she was encouraging Izzy to wake him up again tonight. We informed him that he didn't need to worry. If a monster tried to get our sister, we'd kill it ourselves. I don't know why, but that didn't make him seem any happier. So, that night I was the one who woke up, not my sister. I heard a tapping or a light scraping noise at the window, and when I looked there, I saw a man who looked like a mangy dog. He looked like a character from a Disney movie who had seen better days. Although it looked like he was supposed to be entirely covered in hair, he had big clumps missing on his face, and I forget if it was his neck or his shoulder, then some on his chest. I reached over and started hitting Manny, who punched me really hard on my wrist in his sleep and didn't wake up at all. Izzy was too far away and I didn't want to wake her anyway. I certainly did not want to wake my uncle. For all our talk of guarding our sister, my brother and I had never actually worked out a plan about what we were going to do if an actual monster actually came to visit. I decided it was up to me. I had to scare the wolf thing off. I stood up and started saying stuff that was as close as I could remember to what an exorcist might say. "I cast you out, demon," and that sort of stuff. The hairy, sick-looking manimal outside the window didn't look scared of me at all. He looked curious at first, then as I started to say the Lord's Prayer, his eyes turned angry, and he lifted his nasty-looking lips to show off his even nastier-looking set of monster fangs. I heard it growling through the glass, and then I felt something else, something disorienting in my belly. I felt hot, incredibly hot. The next thing I remember, I was in my uncle's attic, sitting in an old, partially broken wooden chair. I didn't find out it was the attic until later, but that's where I was. The door to the attic was closed, and they told me it would have been impossible for me to have closed it myself. My uncle and aunt sat Izzy and Manny down and asked them point blank, "Who locked your brother in the attic last night?" And both my siblings answered in unison, "The walking dog man." Now, all dogs walk, or all healthy dogs, but what they meant was a dog that walked like a human. Our aunt was dissatisfied with that answer though, and both of them were denied dessert that night. I refused mine in solidarity with them, and we all got ready for a night of more serious monster watching. We did not see the dog man that night, but we did see him 2 more times. One night during the heat wave, my uncle roasted an entire pig. I had never seen such a barbaric scene before, but it created quite a party. People drove in for miles to attend the dinner party. I met a girl my age that night, whose name I won't mention. She and I liked each other in the innocent way 13-year-olds do, and we wandered off into the forest a bit just to chat, the sounds of the party off in the distance. It felt a little more private, but still close to the action and definitely not in a dangerous place. Sometimes feelings can be wrong. There was a howl. And it was close. The girl held her hands over her ears. It must have been much louder for her. Then out of nowhere, that same man thing from the other night came running up just so fast. He was definitely not a she. Some parts of his fur were longish, and others short, with mange spots here, there, and everywhere. Its head was like a wolf with a long snout and ears standing up on its head, but somehow also not like a wolf. Its eyes looked like an animal's eyes, yet somehow seemed intelligent, like a human's. It was taller than us, but not crazy tall. Maybe 6 feet, maybe 6.5 max. It was a lot bigger than we were, and it was frightening. And when it bent over to scream in our face, it became threatening. The girl screamed, but just for a second. Then a glazed look came over her. I could hear the monster growling and wondered why she looked so calm when this sort of wild dog ape thing was growling inches away from her. I saw her jaw go slack, and then the dogman turned to look at me, and I jumped a step backward. I felt the rumbling and spinning tickling me from the insides again, and I guess I went to sleep, because the next thing I knew, I was in a very dark, very dry, very soft place. I tried to get up and I banged my head. Where was I? It smelled like an old storage closet. Suddenly the room filled with light and I heard a woman screaming. It It turns out I actually was in a storage closet containing soft rugs and rags and also cleaning equipment, buckets, mops, cleansers. This closet was not located in my uncle's house, though. It was in a house located over 2 miles away. The mother of this family called my uncle and told him I broke into her home. My aunt came to pick me up, apologizing profusely. She said they were having a party. Nobody realized I'd gone off to cause mischief. I kept trying to defend myself and tell the actual story, but I was hushed every time. It was so hot. People's tempers were very short. I was sent to bed without dinner. I never saw that girl again. I don't know if that means something bad happened to her that night or just because I never asked her last name, I wouldn't know how to check up on her. Life was not as fun the last 2 days we were there, and fortunately the heat wave ended just as my uncle's patience did as well. The night my parents arrived to pick us up and drive us home, we could not have been happier to see them. We all had a big meal and then got ready for the long drive home. At the last minute, my sister realized she couldn't find her favorite doll and began stressing out. I took her up to the bedroom to search around with her for it. I found it under a bed and grabbed it. As I lifted it up, smiling to show Izzy, she let out a cheer. The smile dropped off my face, though, as I saw, looking through the window directly behind Izzy, that same scraggy-looking dog man. Izzy saw the look on my face and froze up. She could see I was looking past her. She started turning her head to see, and I told her, No, Izzy, don't turn around. Just run downstairs and let's go. She looked for a second like she was going to listen to me, but then, suddenly, with one quick movement, she turned around and looked at the window. She let out a short scream, then I saw her start to go slack again, and I could hear the dog man growling. Oh no, not again, I thought as I ran up and dragged my sister out of the room. I was going to drag her down the steps with me too, but she woke up and asked me what I was doing and told me to stop. I handed her the stupid doll and ran downstairs. She followed, and we never saw that ugly monster thing ever again. The heat wave was done, and the dog man receded into ever more distant memory. But I still can't help it. Every time there's a heat wave in New York City, it brings me back to 1977, the summer when my siblings and I were haunted by the dog man.
Ouija Board Dog Man, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. So I hear people bad-mouthing Ouija boards all the time, but those things work. I'd rather badmouth the things in life that don't work. If someone is too out of it to take normal precautions before doing things, then they shouldn't do anything. They should stay in bed. But stop going around telling the rest of us to be afraid of using Ouija boards. That having been said, one time when I used a Ouija board, I nearly got killed by Dog Man. Okay, as you can imagine, this story takes place outside. I used to have this rich friend before they got too stuck up to have any friends, weren't like on TV or whatever. But at that time, my buddy Jake and I were still hanging with this elitist snob we'll call Snobbo, for the sake of this story. No, let's call him Worthington. Let's call him Carruthers. Carruthers it is. So, Carruthers wanted to throw a Friday the 13th party, but we knew nobody would come except us. So we morphed it into a Friday the 13th Ouija board seance, and then people came we didn't even invite. Some of them were pretty girls, so we guys were all in show-off mode. We were trying to impress the young ladies and putting each other down while trying to act like a badass. Who was the bravest? Who would ask the Ouija board the most outrageous questions? That sort of thing. So, we got to talking to one spirit in particular who called himself Lou. We asked Lou where he was, and he spelled out West. We asked him where he died, and he said no. We asked him if he was alive, and the planchette moved to yes. One of the girls started getting really freaked out. She said the Ouija isn't supposed to channel living spirits, that we should stop using it immediately. We all laughed that she was less scared of ghosts than of real people and kept on with our quizzing of Lou. We asked Lou if he could visit us, and he said no. We asked if we could visit him, and the planchette went back to yes. I asked what we could do together, and he spelled out the word diner. Diner, I asked, laughing. You want to meet us at a diner in town? The planchette started spelling out a new word. M-A... Ma, are you telling a yo mama joke? And man, you're saying you're a man? G, mang, that's not a word. E, mange. Oh man, you've got the mange. R, manger, like with the little baby Jesus? And then the spelling stopped, and we were stumped. What did any of that mean? The steam had been sucked out of the conversation, and the questioning ground to a halt. One of my friends decided to go back to the older line of questioning. So you said we could meet you. Where? It spelt out west again. West of where we were was further out into Carruthers' daddy's forest. We asked him what was in there, and he said, trees, from what I can tell. He had never been in the forest on his own property. What kind of a kid was this kid? Anyway, we picked up the Ouija and our stuff and walked west into the forest looking for a spot to set up. We found a perfect place under a tree on a rock. It looked like a scene from a fairy story, and I was really in the mood to get back to questioning Lou with the Ouija. So we settled down, and we asked Lou if we could meet him here. The planchette answered, no. We asked where we should go, and the answer was west. This happened again at the next site, and again at the third. Not everyone wanted to venture west to the fourth spot. We asked the Ouija, Lou, if he could give us a sign when we had walked far enough, and he responded, yes. So now we marched into the unknown. The forest got denser, both on the ground and overhead, and it got darker and darker. It suddenly dawned on me that the sun was going down. I thought we'd better get back. Just 5 minutes more, someone cried out, and we continued. A couple more people now agreed with me that we should head back. We'll head back after we get the sign from Lou. Finally, I was getting tired, and we still had a long trek to get back, so I put my foot down and demanded we go back. There were only 2 people who wanted to go further, but they were very vocal about it. Our argument got louder and louder, and then we heard a crashing sound in the forest, and out of the trees emerged an insane-looking dog with the chest of a human weightlifter and fangs the length of a toothbrush. It sized us up like it was looking at meat hanging in a butcher shop, then I swear the thing grinned. It grinned at us with its incredibly long teeth and evil-looking orange eyes. It looked like it was salivating. Not Lou, laughed one of my friends. His eyes were open a bit too wide. I wondered if he was losing his mind from the stress. He grabbed me hard, hurting me. He pulled my face inches from his wide-eyed. He raved at me, saying, not Lou, Lou-garoo! Rougarou, I asked, but he wasn't listening. He was laughing and ranting. Loup-garou manger le dîner, he said in French. Lou was speaking clearly to us, but he was speaking in French. He wasn't saying he had mange, and he wasn't talking about swaddling clothes or a manger. He was inviting us pour le dîner, for dinner. He was saying manger, which is the French word for eat. He was inviting us further westward to be his dinner. We ran. We ran for our lives, and we ran for our sanity. No matter where I ran, I could see the monster behind me, and it seemed to be only interested in me. I screamed at it to go away. I screamed at the top of my lungs. I was never so terrified in my life. Why was it picking on me? One time I dove behind a rock to hide from it, and it was already behind me, roaring. There was no way it could have been there. It was like it could be anywhere it wanted to be. And it was a thing so ugly you couldn't help but scream when you saw it. There was nothing symmetrical about this creature. I've heard people say they saw a Dogman or Bigfoot and that it was a magnificent creature of beauty. This thing was not. This came fully formed out of a nightmare and seemed to enjoy the role. It had a kind of evil wolf head from an old fairy tale, like the big bad wolf sort of a thing, but not in a humorous way. It had a very long snout and a black nose at the end that mucus dripped out of. Every part of it seemed to be twitching, like it had bugs crawling just under the surface of its flesh. Its eyes twitched like it was on no-dose for 3 days studying for exams. One of its arms was like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but the other was deformed, ending in a 2-fingered claw. I couldn't tell if it was this way due to injury, illness, or the randomness of birth, but I knew it wanted me dead, and its appearance only filled me with more dread. I ran and ran from the monster until suddenly I was out of the forest and running toward a road. I was dizzy and couldn't remember why I was running anymore. I just knew that it was urgent that I keep going. I ran out into the road and a car screeched, trying not to hit me. It hit me anyway. I woke up days later in the hospital, but it wasn't really as dramatic as all that. I just lost a lot of blood, that's all. I can walk, no limp. I got off. Very lucky. When I talked to the other kids later, they all told me the Dogman followed them personally, the same thing I experienced. We wondered if there were more than one of them, but we all described the same asymmetrical abnormalities, so it had to be the exact same Dogman chasing each and every one of us, and almost ending my life in the process. So, anyway, I've used the Ouija board again since then, and I plan on continuing to use it. Why? This story should tell you why. It actually works as a means of communication. What I don't plan on doing ever again, though, is answering any more dinner invitations from Dogman.
Your Bigfoot for President t-shirts, mugs, buttons. Get them now. cafepress.com/Bigfoot for President.
My mom saw a Dogman on a UFO, as told to Peter Bernard. Read by P.Q. Ribber. Okay, this story took place about 2 years ago. My parents are both in their 70s, but they're both active, and they were driving out from New York to visit my wife and my family here on the West Coast. They decided to be tourists like in the old days and try to catch as many roadside attractions along the way as possible. They were staying in haunted bed and breakfasts and the more vintage motels whenever possible, doing the whole nostalgia thing and apparently having a ball. Then, one night, while out late driving to a hotel they had a reservation at, somewhere in the west of Texas, they had a strange UFO sighting that might also be an abduction experience, and Dogman was square in the center of the event. Now, in addition to my concern over my parents, I find this story very alarming because I am aware that in a few reported cases of UFO abductions, it seems the UFO occupants are interested in entire families or even family lines over generations. I have no interest in being experimented on by bug-eyed little space monsters, and I don't want my wife or family exposed to that kind of ongoing torment. Needless to say, we've become very protective of my parents since the incident because it has shaken all of us so greatly. I'll describe the story as they first told it to us. Okay. Mom and Dad are driving at dusk. It's just getting dark out and things are a bit hard to see. They're coming from Stockton, driving down Route 385 to Marathon, Texas, where there is apparently a haunted hotel. It's kind of scrubby desert all around, and almost as soon as they're out of town, it begins to feel a bit like they're in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, They both notice a light in the sky so bright that it seems to be poorly superimposed into their reality like bad special effects. Dad said it was bright, white, and pulsing, but Mom insisted it was the prettiest shade of blue she had ever seen. She said the blue spoke to her in her head and told her she was pretty too. Dad never claimed the light spoke to him. So they said the light sped off forward into the distance past them, and they drove on in the darkness, a bit confused about what had happened. A few minutes later, they could see what looked like some kind of roadblock up ahead. When they got closer, they saw that it was 4 very short people on the road wearing matching dark jumpsuits and this large, hairy man standing in front and to the center of them and the road. The night was dark and there were no street lights, yet the figures could somehow be seen very clearly and in greater detail than should have been possible. Both of them said the humanoids appeared neither male nor female and seemed to be miniature humans. Although they were all bald, they did not have enlarged craniums like the gray space aliens of legend. When it came to describing the hairy creature in front of the small humanoids, however, neither of my parents could agree with the other one about exactly what they had witnessed. Mom said the hairy creature was writhing around, waving its massive sharp claws in the air, making wild expressions on its dog-like face and snarling insanely. She said she was afraid it had rabies or something like that. It had a massive chest like a human male, and it stood up on its hind legs, waving its front paws wildly and threateningly toward them. Still, it never took a step forward, and Mom said it reminded her of those pop-out monsters and dark rides at the carnival. It seemed there to scare them, and it was serving its purpose. Now, my father never says anything about a dog-headed man when he tells the story. He says there was a, quote, big gorilla man, unquote, standing in the middle of the road, giving him the stink eye. He said they made eye contact and were completely in hate with each other from the opening moment. Dad said he saw little people standing behind the gorilla man and was overwhelmed with the feeling that something extremely wrong was taking place here. Dad says he gunned the engine and raced forward with the intention of making them scatter or running them down, and when he did, they just weren't there anymore, and they drove the rest of the way home. They had lost an hour somewhere, but it didn't seem significant then. So that was the end of the story as far as Dad was concerned. But Mom started reading about UFOs in old books and watching YouTube videos about alien abductions. And she decided she wanted to be hypnotically regressed to find out if anything else happened that night. Dad and I were both against this idea, since a hypnotist can just as easily put something into your memory as take something out. Mom went anyway, and the memories or imaginings that she recovered are truly bizarre. According to Mom, when the beings confronted them, they lost control of their bodies and became light, like helium balloons rising out of their seats. One of the tiny people pointed a magic wand at them, and they floated up into the night. The next memory she has is waking up in a vast operating room, stretching further than her eyes could see, with operating table after operating table after operating table, each containing a different human, each being operated on by a number of strange creatures. Also roaming between the tables were a number of the large hairy men with dog heads, snarling and threatening everyone continually, but being ignored for the most part. She looked around, but couldn't see Dad. She saw people all around her asleep, none of whom she recognized. Mom says a young Asian woman laying next to her woke up and started screaming. A dog-headed man raced over and roared at her. This made the woman scream more, and the dog thing raised its massive claws menacingly and roared louder. The lady passed out, and, according to Mom, the dog man grew a second head and screamed in triumph, beating its chest before walking onward. She says someone was waving something in front of her, and the next memory she has is of my father gunning the engine in the car and speeding on the highway. Mom says Dogman is a creature bred and trained as security by these abductor creatures. She calls them space aliens when referring to them, but told me she feels they are probably from here on Earth somewhere. Maybe under the earth, maybe under the water, maybe from a slightly different vibration of reality. It's just easier to call them space aliens, and so she does. Now, my father regards everything my mother came out of that hypnosis session with as bunk. He thinks she imagined the dog head on the creature, as he insists he made eye contact with it for at least 15 seconds, and it had gorilla-like or caveman-like face. He doesn't remember seeing ears on the thing, but he is certain they weren't on top of its head or dog-like in any way. He says it looked like a cross between a gorilla and a human, whereas Mom saw something snarling and threatening. Dad says this creature just stood very tall like a man and stared him down with a look of utter disgust. Dad never says anything about the creature snarling or acting threateningly, just standing still and glaring. How could their two accounts be so vastly different? What were they both actually seeing? Were they seeing anything outside of themselves at all? Was it some sort of projection? If so, was this something projected into their minds and interpreted by their nervous systems differently, or something projected onto the road in front of them? If it was a projection of some sort, what happened during the missing hour of time? The more questions you ask about this incident, the more questions get raised. I've encouraged my parents to come forward to a legitimate researcher to be interviewed, but my father refuses to be connected to my mother's version of events. He says she's making up a bunch of comic book crap, which turns the story into some kind of cartoon. I asked him to explain what happened during the missing hour, if he doesn't like Mom's version of events, and he has nothing to say on that subject whatsoever. So, I don't know what happened to my parents. I find it interesting that a dogman-type creature was seen in conjunction with abducting alien creatures, but I find it just as interesting that my father saw something more like a Bigfoot or a caveman than a dogman at the same time my mother had her vision. Is dogman something that actually exists, or are these other intelligences able to project fear-based entities that we personally interpret in the way that would most frighten us? Dad saw a Sasquatch. Mom saw a dogman. Would some people see a rake or a reptilian if that would be more frightening to them? Is it possible that dogman and Bigfoot are creatures of our imagination given life by these alien techniques? Or are they real creatures that the aliens are able to manifest copies of in order to keep us frightened and subdued? Maybe all of these things are true, and maybe none of them are. All I know is my mom saw Dogman on a UFO.
And now, Dogman in My Garage, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. My house has a one-car garage that's technically attached but can only be entered through the large front door, the way the car gets in and out. So imagine my surprise one night when I opened the door to get in my car and was met with the sound of a dog growling. And then imagine how I felt when the dog suddenly stood up. Okay, let me go back to the beginning. We had just moved into the house that weekend, and we, my wife and I, both wanted pizza for dinner. I was elected to drive into town and pick it up, so I went outside to the aforementioned garage. I don't know how to explain it, but I sensed something was wrong right off the bat. Something warned me to be careful when I hit my remote and sent that door moving upward. But I had parked the car in that driveway just that morning, and I knew for a fact there was nothing to be scared of in that garage. Nothing had been in there when I was in there last, and there was no other entrance except the one I was about to open. So why was I so nervous to open it? And yet I stood there, feeling myself begin to sweat. Why? Eventually, my adult mind overruled whatever part of me was sensing danger, and I opened the garage door. I did not immediately go inside, but looked around first. That was the deal I had made with my inner child. If you let me open the garage door, I'll let you look around before we go in there. After looking around and seeing nothing out of the ordinary, I took a step into the garage. I didn't take a second step, because that first one was met with the aforementioned growling. It didn't sound like the growling of a Chihuahua or a Beagle Terrier. It didn't sound like the growling of a Doberman or even a Great Dane. It sounded like the growling of something even larger than any of those. And yet, I saw no animal anywhere. I kept going to take my second step, but each time I did, the growling would get more intense and fierce. Whatever this thing was, it could see me, but I couldn't see it. I looked up, I looked down. All I could see was this one room, some supplies left over from the previous owner, and my car. That was when I noticed the trunk of my car was doing a little dance. If you don't know what I mean, don't feel alone. I don't really know what I mean either. It's just that my trunk seemed to bob up and down and sideways a little bit too. At this point, I was wondering if I was inhaling paint fumes or something and hallucinating. First I heard growling, then my car moved. Would I hear my car growl next? I was about to go get my wife and figure out if I was losing my mind when I saw someone leaning on the front hood of my car. At first I actually thought it was a shadow figure. It was that dark, but then I saw a glint in its eyes and made out the unmistakable silhouette of a very large dog with its front paws leaning on my car hood. How the hell did that thing get in our garage? Now I have to say, the first thing I thought of when I saw this thing was the old stories about black dogs coming and terrifying or even killing people in the old days. I forget where I read that, but supposedly it was an actual thing. People used to be afraid of black dogs and view them as supernatural. My heart was racing and the blood was pumping so fast to my head that I could feel and hear it. I was panicked. I had always thought of myself as being open to the possibility of paranormal and supernatural occurrences, but now that I was actually confronted with something that seemed to fit into that category, I wanted to cry and run home to my mother. I guess no matter how much I claimed to be open-minded, I was still really a materialist. This big black dog growling at me was breaking my concept of reality apart. I knew that even if the dog never touched me, he had already changed my life permanently just by showing himself to me. Now, the adult part of my mind tried to take over once again at this point. I needed to let the dog out of the garage. Once it escaped, I could use my car. Then I'd have to figure out how the heck the animal got in there and prevent it from happening again. But the first and main priority was to get out of the dog's way before it ate me and let it go free. So I retreated to the house and watched the garage from the kitchen window. Once I saw it leave, I would know it was okay for me to go get pizza. Eventually, my wife wandered by and asked me why I hadn't left to get the pizza yet. I told her she'd better sit down for this one and told her everything I just told you. She was scoffing and saying it was impossible. I couldn't disagree with her, it really was impossible. It was also what happened, though. So she went about her business warning me that I had 10 minutes to leave or she was going to call for delivery and make me tip the guy. I kept watching the garage door. My stomach made weird noises. I was starting to think about calling for delivery myself. That's when I saw it. The dog. It came out of the garage cautiously, sneaking around the side of my car, still holding onto the sides of it and up on its hind leg. Then it did this thing that really surprised me. It let go of my car and stood up all on its own. It just stood there like a man and looked around as though this were a normal thing for a dog to do. I thought about going outside to scare it off, but it dawned on me that this guy, and it definitely was a guy, was taller than I was when it stood up like that. I banged on the window, hoping to cause it to run away, but instead the dog ran back into the garage, on its hind legs of course, and I couldn't see it anymore. So my wife came back and saw me still by the window, and she started treating me like a child. She absolutely didn't believe me when I told her about the dog. She took my hand and led me to the garage. I told her it wasn't safe, that this was where I heard the dog growl. She said she couldn't hear it. I listened. I couldn't hear it either. She told me I was being ridiculous and asked me for the car keys. I protested, but she interrupted and demanded the keys, so I gave them to her. She started to walk in toward the driver's seat and asked me if I wanted to come with. I ran in, looking for the dog, hoping I would see it before it did something I would regret. My wife got in the car and unlocked the passenger seat. Like Pavlov's dog, I got inside, but I was still looking around, panicked. My wife was laughing openly at me. She started the engine and something stood up that had been crouching in front of the car. It was the black dog, big as a bear. It stood as tall as it could, its massive arms in front of it, and it roared. My wife screamed and screamed. Then she also screamed. She stared too. Staring and screaming, that was her thing at that moment. I would have preferred she drove out of the garage instead, so I shifted the gear into reverse and pushed on her knee to try to get her to step on the gas pedal. She woke from her screaming reverie long enough to do as I suggested. She floored the gas and we drove out of that garage and clear across the street before she applied the brakes. We nearly ran backward into a tree. We only missed it by inches. But there was no time to relax as the upright walking black dog ran out of our garage and directly for us. My wife did some fancy maneuvering and managed to pull forward and to our left. The creature banged directly onto my door, and now it was my turn to scream like a lunatic. I screamed as my wife drove away and kept screaming for a while longer than I meant to. It was something that seemed almost out of my control for a while. So, that night, we stayed at the motel near the pizza place. We debated selling the house right away and going, but we had spent more than we could afford just to move there, and moving again didn't seem like an option. We decided to try to rough it out and learn to live with this upright walking dog in the neighborhood until we could afford to move. We'd make moving our top priority and get out in a few months. We only had to survive a few months of the dog man. Or so we figured. Anyway, that was almost 8 years ago now. We never saw that creature again. We never found any way it could have gotten into our garage, and we never saw it again. It remains to this day the greatest unsolved mystery of my or my wife's life. We still live in that house, and we will probably go to our graves wondering how the heck Dog Man got in our garage. Don't forget, you can support our channel by subscribing at peterbernard.com. Subscribing gets you secret preview videos and other surprises, so join up today. Plus, we've got our new Scary Stories NYC t-shirt, which everyone loves. We'll be right back with another scary Dogman story, but first, here's Patricia with an informative message about how you can submit your story for us to read. Patricia?
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Dogman in the Cemetery, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. The other night, I was driving past this cemetery in our neighborhood. It has Civil War era graves from the 1800s and has a small, knee-high metal fence around it. It used to be in the middle of the forest, but now the service road leading from the highway to my gated community passes right by it. I find the graveyard to be both rustic and authentically charming in both a historical and a personal sense, and I always at least gaze at it when I pass. But, like I said, the other night I was driving by, and when I looked, I saw something I've never seen before. I saw figures in the cemetery, sneaky figures, as in people sneaking around or lurking. They were hiding behind the taller gravestones, and I could clearly see a figure behind a tree. It looked like someone intended some kind of trouble for our little historic cemetery. I thought about driving the rest of the way into town and getting security to come out and deal with it, but I thought maybe I could scare them off myself. Some of us get foolishly overconfident when we're behind the wheel of a car. So I stopped driving, pulled back a little, and angled my car to point toward the graveyard. Then I put on the high beams and shouted out of my window, "Hey, you! You better get out of there!" I waited, and at first, nothing happened. I inhaled to shout a second time, and then I saw someone darting from behind one tree to behind another one. He moved in such a sneaky fashion. He looked strangely guilty. That's the word that oddly hung over the scene. These people felt guilty about something. At least that's what their body posture communicated in the brief moments when I caught their creepy silhouettes. Shining my high beams at them hadn't shown me anything more than I had seen before, so I switched back to my normal headlights and decided to just drive home and let security handle it. And of course, that's when my car engine decided to give out. Just like that, it conked out dead. I tried to start the car again and again. This was not where I wanted to get stuck. It was getting darker, and I had no idea what kind of trouble those guilty-looking people sneaking around the cemetery had planned. What if they were some kind of sick cultists? What if they were into human sacrifice? I made sure all my doors were locked and kept trying the engine when I saw the creepy shadow people begin to creep out of the shadows. Then I could see, even in the darkness, that they weren't human. Or at least they weren't entirely human. They walked like people, that's for sure. They walked on their hind legs, or I should say they creeped. They snuck. They tiptoed. They kept looking around as though not wanting to be seen by anyone else. They didn't seem to care anymore if I saw them. I wondered if I were ever going to leave this scene. Maybe this would be where I died. I felt a sense of relief when I realized I could just call security and have them come help me. But my relief turned to panicked horror as I remembered I had left my cell phone home. I checked all my pockets anyway, but I was certain I didn't think I would need it on this trip since I was just mailing some bills in town. Now the sweat was dripping into my eyes and stinging. My hands were all clammy too. I was really in a bad place, and I knew it. I could see that all these dogs had stationed themselves all around my car. They were mostly hidden in shadows behind bushes, trees, and rock. Some of them stood brazenly in the open, though, and I could see that these were the equivalent in size to men over 6 feet tall. Sneaky, guilty-looking men over 6 feet tall, but still. I am not ashamed to admit that I prayed that night. I had nothing to lose, and I was beginning to think I would never make it to the morning. I prayed in a most sincere fashion, entirely forgetting all the pro-atheist arguments I had written on the internet over the years. I figured if there was no higher power, then it didn't matter, and if there was, I probably had a bit of catching up to do. So I prayed. I begged for a chance to survive this. I promised if I were allowed to escape this unharmed, I would devote my life to something more worthwhile. I had no idea what I was talking about. I just didn't want to die that night. So, as if to answer my prayer, a car drove up behind me, and the dogmen scattered like cockroaches. They weren't entirely gone, but they had gone back into their sneaky, creepy hiding spots. The car pulled up next to me, and I recognized it as my neighbor Sandy. She asked me if I needed a jump, but I just asked if she could drive me back to the gated community. I resolved to deal with the car once the sun had come up. I just wanted safety for tonight. Sandy agreed, And then I had to drum up the courage to actually unlock my car and get out, then walk all the way around her Buick and get in the passenger seat. I was absolutely terrified of getting out into what might be a very dangerous and painful situation. I sat there trying to will myself to get out and unable to move. My eyes started crying. I myself was too panicked to cry. It was like my body was crying in fear, unable to move. I counted to 3, closed my eyes, then made a break for it. I ran into her car, threw myself in, slammed the door, locking it. I begged her to drive. She looked at me and I looked around and asked me if I was all right. I begged her once again to drive, and I said I'd explain it to her later. I never did. I never planned to either. And that's the story of the time I saw the guilty, sneaky dogmen that like to hang around really old cemeteries. I only drive past that place in the day now. If I ever have to drive past it at night again, I promise you I will speed past it. I would never intentionally stop at that graveyard. It feels like it's been claimed as the turf of the Dogman.
Come back for more scary stories.